Ardennes Forest, 1944. The German patrol moved cautiously through the snow, 12 men, their breath fogging in the cold. They heard nothing but the crunch of ice beneath their boots and the faint wind through the skeletal trees. Then it came. Not the single crack of a rifle, but 8 rapid shots echoing through the forest like a thunderclap. In seconds, 2 men fell. The rest dove for cover, confused, panicked. Ein Maschinengewehr, someone yelled. A machine gun? No, it wasn't. It was one man, one American. The weapon, the M1 Garand. Hitler's troops had been trained to dominate with precision bolt-action rifles. But against this semi-automatic weapon, fast, rugged, relentless, their advantage vanished. This is the story of the weapon that changed fear itself. The rifle that made the German army whisper a name they would come to dread. Der Selbstlader, the self-loader. Step back to the 1930 seconds. The world's armies still marched with weapons born of the previous century. The German Kar 98K, the British Lee Enfield, the Soviet Mosin Nagant. Bolt-action rifles, every one of them. Pull the trigger, work the bolt, eject the casing chamber the next round. Click, aim, fire. Repeat. It was the rhythm every soldier knew, the tempo of infantry combat since the late 1800s. The United States military was no different. Conservative, cautious, bound by doctrine and the weight of tradition. The idea of a semi-automatic rifle, one that could fire as fast as you could pull the trigger, seemed almost fantastical. Too complicated, the generals said. Too expensive. Too prone to jamming in the mud and chaos of battle. Yet one man saw differently. John Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born engineer working in the quiet halls of Springfield Armory, Massachusetts. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a theorist. He was a designer, a tinkerer, a man obsessed with solving the impossible. And in 1936, against all odds and institutional resistance, the United States Army made a decision that would echo across the battlefields of the world. They adopted the M1 Garand as their standard-issue rifle, the first nation on Earth to arm its entire infantry with a semi-automatic weapon. The irony was almost poetic. A Canadian immigrant working in an American arms factory had designed what Germany would come to fear most. At first, the Germans dismissed it. Intelligence reports filtered back. Too complicated, they concluded. Too expensive to mass produce. A luxury weapon for a wealthy nation. But by 1944 inches, the hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, the mountains of Italy, that perception would shatter. Violently. Because while Germany built mechanical masterpieces, America built miracles by the million. The question that would haunt German commanders for the rest of the war was simple, terrifying. How could one rifle mass-produced by a democracy outfight an empire of engineers? John Garand's workshop at Springfield Armory was not a place of grand ambition. It was a place of patience, of endless prototypes and failed mechanisms, of springs that broke and gas systems that fouled. The challenge he faced was brutal in its simplicity. Create a rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger, that could withstand mud, sand, rain and snow, that could be manufactured by the hundreds of thousands, and that any farmhand turned soldier could operate and maintain. It seemed impossible. Bolt-action rifles worked because they were simple. The soldier was the machine. He worked the bolt, he controlled the tempo. But a semi-automatic rifle had to harness the explosive force of each shot, redirect it, cycle the mechanism, eject the spent casing chamber, a new round, and reset the trigger, all in a fraction of a second. And it had to do this reliably thousands of times in conditions that would destroy lesser machines. Garand's solution was elegant. Near the muzzle of the barrel, a small port allowed expanding gases to enter a cylinder. These gases drove a piston backward, which in turn operated a rotating bolt. The bolt unlocked, extracted the spent casing, compressed a spring, then was driven forward again by that same spring, stripping a new round from the 8-round en-bloc clip and locking it into the chamber. All of this happened in the time it took to blink. But elegance meant nothing if it couldn't be built. And here Garand revealed his genius. He designed for mass production. No overly tight tolerances. No exotic materials. No components that required master gunsmiths to hand-fit. The M1 Garand was built on a philosophy that was distinctly American. If a farmhand can fix it with basic tools, a soldier can fight with it anywhere. The rifle was approved in 1936, but production was slow. Skepticism lingered. Officers who had spent their entire careers with bolt actions looked at this new weapon with suspicion. What if it jammed? What if soldiers wasted ammunition? What if the complexity proved too much under fire? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Germany watched with mild interest and less concern. Their Kar-98K was a proven weapon, accurate, reliable, born of a tradition that stretched back to the Franco-Prussian War. Why fix what wasn't broken? But there was something the Germans failed to understand, something fundamental about the nature of modern war. Firepower wasn't just about accuracy anymore. It was about volume. It was about the number of bullets a single soldier could deliver downrange in the critical seconds when contact was made. And in that calculation, the mathematics had shifted dramatically. A trained soldier with a Kar-98K could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute. A soldier with an M1 Garand could fire 40 or more. In a squad of 8 men, that difference was apocalyptic. While Europe trusted the old rhythm click bolt aim fire, the Americans had already broken the tempo of war. By 1941, as factories across the United States began churning out Garands by the thousand, something remarkable was happening. Assembly lines that had once built cars now built rifles. Women who had never touched a weapon before were assembling gas cylinders and trigger assemblies with precision. Springfield Armory, Winchester, Harrington and Richardson all racing to meet impossible quotas. And in training camps from Georgia to California, young men, many of whom had never fired a gun, were learning a new rhythm. 8 shots, fast as you can pull the trigger, the ping of the ejecting en-bloc clip. Reload. 8 more. Garand didn't just build a weapon, he built a new cadence, one trigger pull at a time. German infantry doctrine in 1942 was a study in controlled violence. The backbone of every squad was the MG-42 machine gun, a weapon so fast it sounded like tearing cloth, capable of spitting out 1200 rounds per minute. But the MG-42 required a crew, a gunner and assistant ammunition carriers. It was a team weapon, devastating but dependent. The riflemen existed to support the machine gun. They moved with precision, fired with discipline. The Kar-98K demanded this discipline. 5 rounds in an internal magazine. Work the bolt between each shot. Accuracy over volume. Marksmanship over suppression. It was a philosophy born in the trenches of the First World War, refined over decades. And it had worked. In Poland, in France, in the vast expanses of Russia. The Wehrmacht had conquered a continent with these weapons. But then came North Africa. November 1942. Operation Torch. American troops, green and untested, poured onto the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. The Germans battling both the British 8th Army, and now these newcomers began to notice something strange in the after-action reports. Enemy fire volume exceeds expected capacity. Small arms engagement intensity inconsistent with known American armament. Interrogation of American prisoners revealed the source. A semi-automatic rifle, standard issue. Every single rifleman carried one. At first, German officers were skeptical of the reports. Surely this was an exaggeration. Perhaps the Americans had deployed more machine guns than usual. Perhaps their troops were simply undisciplined, wasting ammunition in wild volleys. But as the weeks turned to months, as the battles in Tunisia intensified, the pattern became undeniable. A German squad advancing through an olive grove would take contact, the familiar sound of rifle fire. But instead of the measured crack, crack, crack of bolt actions, there was a sustained roar. 8 Americans firing 8 rounds each before pausing to reload. 64 bullets in the air in mere seconds. To soldiers trained to count enemy shots, to time their movements between the rhythm of bolt cycles, this was madness. This was impossible. Rommel's staff began compiling reports. The Americans possess an advantage in individual firepower that compensates for their tactical inexperience. In the terms of warfare, this was damning with faint praise. What it meant, stripped of military politeness, was this: American soldiers were making mistakes that should have been fatal, but their rifles were keeping them alive. The contrast was stark. The Kar-98K was a surgeon's scalpel, precise, deliberate, in the hands of a veteran, deadly at ranges that exceeded the Garand's effective distance. But the M1 Garand was a hammer, and America had millions of hammers. Consider the mathematics. A A German rifle squad, 10 men, perhaps 9, with Kar-9 8Ks and 1 with an MP-40 submachine gun. In a sudden engagement at close range, they could deliver perhaps 20 aimed shots in the first critical seconds. An American rifle squad, 12 men, all with M1 Garands. They could deliver nearly 100 rounds in that same span of time. It wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about forcing him to take cover, to hesitate, to lose the initiative. Suppressive fire had always been the domain of machine guns. Now every American rifleman was a suppression weapon unto himself. German veterans began to adjust their tactics. They learned to respect the volume of fire. They learned not to advance too aggressively against dug-in Americans. They learned that the sound of continuous rifle fire didn't mean panic, it meant doctrine. But learning came at a cost, measured in blood and shattered offensives, and this was only North Africa. The deserts where visibility was long and engagements often occurred at range where the Kar-9 8K's accuracy still mattered. Soon the war would move to Italy, to France, to the close quarters nightmare of hedgerows and forests. There, the new rhythm would become a requiem. Tunisia, March 1943. A German lieutenant crouched behind a low stone wall, his field glasses trained on an American position 300 meters distant. His squad was pinned down, had been for 20 minutes. Machine gun fire from the American lines had forced them to ground. But that wasn't what troubled him. It was the rifles. He had counted, watched the muzzle flashes, expected the pause, the momentary lull when men worked their bolts. But the fire never stopped. It rolled like thunder, continuous, relentless. He lowered his glasses and turned to his sergeant. "How many machine guns do they have?" The sergeant shook his head. "I don't think those are machine guns, Herr Leutnant." Later, after they had withdrawn under cover of smoke, after 3 of his men had been carried back on stretchers, he would write in his after-action report, "Enemy demonstrated unexpected fire discipline and volume. Recommend caution when engaging American infantry at ranges under 400 meters." What he didn't write, what he couldn't articulate, was the feeling, the sense that the rules had changed, that something fundamental about infantry combat had shifted beneath his feet. Allied intelligence officers, interrogating captured German soldiers, began to notice a pattern in the testimonies. Again and again the prisoners mentioned American automatic rifles or self-loading weapons. Some believed every American soldier carried a light machine gun. Others thought the Americans had unlimited ammunition and no concern for conservation. The truth was simpler and more profound. The M1 Garand had democratized firepower. In the desert, the rifle proved itself in ways that surprised even its advocates. Sand and dust, the killers of complex mechanisms, barely slowed the Garand. Its gas system was robust, its tolerances loose enough to function even when grit invaded every crevice. American armorers found that a basic field cleaning a few minutes with a brush and oil kept the weapon running through sandstorms that would choke lesser designs. By July 1943, the invasion of Sicily brought new terrain and new lessons. In the rocky hills and narrow valleys, combat compressed into brutal close-quarters engagements. Here, the Garand's advantages became overwhelming. A German squad moving through a terraced vineyard would crest a ridge and find Americans dug in on the opposite slope, perhaps 70 meters away. In the time it took the Germans to assess, to take cover, to bring their weapons to bear, the Americans had already unleashed a storm. One after-action report from a U.S. infantry company described an engagement near Gela. Enemy force estimated at platoon strength attempted to assault our position. Defensive fire from rifles alone without machine gun support broke the attack within 90 seconds. Enemy withdrew, leaving 8 KIA. 90 seconds, 30 American riflemen. 240 rounds minimum delivered in a minute and a half. The psychological impact was immeasurable. German soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, where they had faced the savage determination of Soviet troops, armed with bolt action, Mosin Nagants found themselves outgunned by what they had been told were soft, inexperienced Americans. One captured Obergefreiter, wounded in the shoulder outside Palermo, spoke candidly to his interrogator. "We thought they would break easily. But their rifles, they don't stop shooting. You hear them and you think this is a whole company firing, but it's just one squad. How do you assault into that?" the interrogator noted in his report. Subject displayed genuine respect, possibly fear of American rifle firepower. Fear, not of American courage or tactics, but of their weapons. of the mechanical advantage that allowed a 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa to deliver the same volume of fire as 3 German veterans. The irony wasn't lost on some German officers. They had spent years perfecting infantry doctrine, training their men to function as precise instruments of war. And now they faced an enemy whose doctrine was simpler, cruder even, but backed by a technological edge that rewarded aggression over finesse. The weapon had become the great equalizer, and the Americans had barely begun to learn how to use it. Inside the mechanism of the M1 Garand was a kind of industrial poetry. Near the muzzle, a small port, no wider than a pencil, tapped into the barrel. When the rifle fired, expanding gases rushed through this port into a cylinder, driving a piston backward with tremendous force. This piston rotated and unlocked, the bolt extracted. The spent casing compressed an operating spring. Then physics took over. The spring drove everything forward again, stripping a fresh cartridge from the N-block clip, chambering it, locking the bolt. All of this in less than 1/10 of a second. What made it revolutionary wasn't complexity, it was simplicity. Garand had designed a system with relatively few moving parts. Parts that could be manufactured on standard machining equipment. Parts that didn't require hand-fitting by master craftsmen. The rifle could tolerate dirt, moisture, temperature extremes. It could be assembled by workers who had never built a weapon before. And that mattered, because by 1943, American industry was performing a miracle. Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, Winchester Repeating Arms in Connecticut, Harrington and Richardson in Rhode Island, International Harvester, a company that built tractors and farm equipment retooled to build rifles. The assembly lines ran day and night. Women, many of whom had lost husbands or sons to the war, worked alongside older men, exempt from service, and young men waiting for their draft numbers. They machined receivers, fitted barrels, assembled trigger groups. Quality control inspectors tested every rifle, firing it, checking headspace, ensuring it met specifications. The production numbers were staggering. By the end of 1943, over 2 million M1 Garands had been manufactured. By war's end, that number would exceed 5.5 million. 5.5 million semi-automatic rifles. More than every other nation's semi-automatic rifle production combined. Germany, recognizing their disadvantage, attempted to respond. The Gewehr 41, developed in the early war years, was an overcomplicated disaster. It required the muzzle to be covered with a special cone to capture gas fouled easily, and was despised by the troops who received it. The Gewehr 43, introduced in 1943, was better. It borrowed design elements from the Soviet SVT-40, used a gas system similar in principle to the Garands, but it came too late and in too few numbers. German industry stretched to breaking by the demands of tank production, aircraft manufacturing, and the endless appetite of the Eastern Front couldn't mass-produce the G43 in meaningful quantities. Perhaps 4,000,000 were made, total, across the entire war. For every German semi-automatic rifle produced, America built more than 13 M1 Garands. The mathematics of firepower had fundamentally shifted, and the Germans knew it. There was something else. Something the soldiers talked about, but the engineers never intended. The ping. When the last round was fired from an M1 Garand, the N-block clip was ejected automatically, making a distinctive metallic ping as it left the rifle. This sound became iconic, mythologized. Some said it gave away a soldier's position, told the enemy he was empty and vulnerable. The reality was more complex. In the chaos of combat, with explosions shouting machine gun fire, the small ping of a single clip ejecting was almost impossible to hear beyond a few meters. And even if an enemy soldier did hear it, waiting for that moment meant enduring the 7 previous shots, meant hoping you could identify which American was empty among a squad of 12, meant exposing yourself to reload exactly when the soldier was slamming a fresh clip home. It was a myth born of peacetime range, shooting, not battlefield reality. What wasn't a myth was American production capacity. Crates of M1 Garands stacked in warehouses from California to England. Enough rifles to arm every infantryman, every tank crewman who needed one, every Marine storming Pacific beaches. Enough to send as military aid, enough to stockpile for the future. For every rifle, the Reich over-engineered America simply built 10 that worked. That was the lesson Germany learned too late. Innovation without production is merely interesting. Production without innovation is stagnation. But innovation married to industrial might, that changes the world. The 6th of June 1944, Omaha Beach. The ramps of the Higgins boats dropped, and men poured into water, stained red. Those who made it to the shore, who survived the killing ground of sand and obstacles, carried their M1 Garands above their heads, keeping the mechanisms clear of salt water. Within hours, as the beachhead expanded, as engineers blew gaps in the wire, and infantry pushed inland, German defenders encountered something they had been warned about but never truly understood. The sound of an American platoon advancing through smoke and chaos wasn't the disciplined crack of individual riflemen. It was a continuous roar, a wall of fire that seemed impossible to emerge from. A German machine gun nest dug into the hedgerow at the edge of a Norman field opened fire on advancing Americans. Standard tactics, the MG-42 gunner traversed his fire, forcing the attackers to ground. His assistant fed the belt. The rifleman beside them waited for targets, but the return fire didn't come in measured bursts. It came as a sustained crescendo. The Americans, unable to see the exact position of the gun through the thick hedgerow, simply fired at the sound. 12 men, 8 rounds, each reloading and firing again. The dirt around the German position erupted in impacts. Leaves and branches shredded. Ricochets screamed off stones. The machine gun fell silent. Not because it was hit, but because the gunner couldn't raise his head. The volume of incoming fire, the sheer density of bullets cutting through the air, made it suicide to expose yourself even for a second. This was the hedgerow country of Normandy. Close terrain, limited visibility. Every field a potential killing ground, every stone wall a fortress. Here, the advantages of the Kar-98K's accuracy at range meant nothing. Here, combat was decided in seconds at distances measured in tens of meters, not hundreds. Here, the M1 Garand was king. By December 1944, the war had moved to the Ardennes forest. Hitler's last great offensive in the West, a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp. In the snow and fog, German forces achieved surprise, pushed back, American units created chaos. But even in retreat, even in the desperate defense of crossroads and villages, the Americans maintained a crucial advantage. A German Unteroffizier leading his squad through the pine trees south of Bastogne heard it first. That sound, the rapid, rhythmic fire of American rifles. He raised his fist, stopped his men, listened. 8 shots, pause, ping, then 8 more. How many, his corporal whispered. The Unteroffizier shook his head. In the forest, sound echoed, distorted. It could be a single squad or an entire platoon. But he had learned through bitter experience never to underestimate that sound. They withdrew, circled, tried to flank. But the Americans dug into a farmhouse with clear fields of fire, turned them back with concentrated volleys that seemed to come from everywhere at once. German field reports from the Bulge are filled with references to American defensive fire. Enemy maintains high volume of rifle fire even when outnumbered. Small unit cohesion preserved through superior individual armament. Recommend approach via covered routes to minimize exposure to rifle fire. These were the words of soldiers learning to fear not the enemy's courage or skill, but his tools. A German corporal captured near Street. Vith spoke to his interrogators with a kind of weary resignation. We are told we are the superior soldiers, better trained, more experienced, and maybe this is true. But your rifles, they make up for much. A green American soldier with that rifle is worth 2 of our veterans with the Kar-98K. This is not propaganda, this is what we see. The rifle was no longer just a weapon. It had become a sound the enemy learned to dread. A mechanical rhythm that announced American presence that said, "We are here, we are many, and we will not stop shooting." In the dark forests of the Ardennes, that sound was the last thing many German soldiers heard. Germany had always been a nation of engineers, of precision, of craftsmanship elevated to the level of art. The Tiger tank, a masterpiece of armor and firepower so complex it required hundreds of man-hours to build. The Me-262 jet fighter years ahead of its time, so advanced it needed rare alloys and specialized factories. Even their small arms reflected this philosophy. The Kar-98K was a beautiful weapon, its action smooth as silk, its accuracy legendary. But beauty doesn't win wars, production does. In the American factories, a different philosophy reigned. Functionality over elegance, reliability over perfection. The M1 Garand wasn't the most accurate rifle in the world, It wasn't the lightest or the most refined. What it was, fundamentally, was good enough, and it could be built by the millions. Springfield Armory alone was producing over 4,000 rifles per day. By 1944, 4,000. Each one tested, each one functional, each one ready to ship to training camps or directly to the front. The factory floors were symphonies of industrial might. Stamping presses shaped receivers with rhythmic thunder. Milling machines carved bolt assemblies from steel billets. Assembly lines moved with mechanical precision, each worker adding one component, one step in the transformation of raw metal into a weapon of war. And the workers themselves were a revolution. Women, barred from combat, found their place in the arsenal of democracy. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. She was real, replicated in thousands of factories across America. They measured tolerances, assembled trigger groups, performed quality inspections. The rifles they built would be carried by their brothers, their husbands, their sons. There was poetry in this, a citizen army armed by citizens, democracy manufacturing its own defense. Germany couldn't match this, not for lack of skill or knowledge, but for lack of resources, lack of security, lack of the vast ocean barriers that kept American factories safe from bombing. By 1944, Allied bombers were pounding German industry day and night. Factories that might have produced semi-automatic rifles were instead desperately trying to maintain output of more critical weapons, or they were rubble. The Gewehr 43, Germany's answer to the Garand, was fielded in numbers that would have been impressive in any other war. But against American production, the numbers were laughable. A few 100,000 versus millions. And quality suffered. Late-war G-43s built with increasingly poor materials by increasingly exhausted workers were prone to failures. Soldiers who received them often preferred to keep their Kar-98KS weapons they could trust. The irony was profound. German engineers had understood perhaps before anyone the value of semi-automatic infantry rifles. They had developed prototypes in the 1,930 seconds, but they had never committed, never made the leap from concept to mass production. They had assumed perhaps that their bolt actions and their machine guns would be sufficient. They had assumed wrong. While Germany built wonders for museums, America built tools for men. Consider the strategic mathematics. Every M1 Garand represented roughly 50 hours of labor and $25 worth of materials. Expensive by rifle standards, but affordable for an economy the size of America's. Each rifle increased the combat effectiveness of a single soldier by perhaps 200% compared to a bolt action. For the cost of a single Tiger tank, America could produce 2,000 M1 Garands. Each tank required a crew of 5 and consumed fuel at an astonishing rate. Each rifle required only a single soldier and a handful of cartridges. This was the arithmetic of total war. Not the elegance of individual weapons, but the overwhelming mass of adequate weapons distributed without limitation. Rows of Garands stacked in depot warehouses, crates upon crates stretching to the ceiling. Each crate represented 8 rifles. Each rifle represented an American soldier with the firepower of 3 Germans. The sound in those factories, the pneumatic hammers, the presses, the conveyor belts, that was the true sound of the war. Not the crack of rifles or the thunder of artillery, but the industrial heartbeat of a democracy that had decided to win. And in that rhythm, steady and unstoppable, Germany heard its future. The war ended in 1945. In the ruins of Berlin, in the devastated landscapes of Europe, German officers found themselves prisoners, subjects of interrogation, witnesses to their own defeat. Some were defiant, others were relieved. But many, when the conversation turned to weapons and tactics, expressed a kind of reluctant admiration. One Oberst, a career officer who had fought from Poland to the final defense of Germany, sat across from an American intelligence officer in a makeshift interrogation room. The American curious asked what had surprised him most about fighting the United States. The German thought for a long moment. "Your rifle," he said finally. "We knew about it, of course. Intelligence reports. Captured examples. But knowing about a weapon and facing it across a battlefield are different things. That rifle, it changed how we had to fight. It forced us to be more cautious. It made our doctrine, our training suddenly less effective." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We underestimated what it would mean for every single enemy soldier to have that capability. We thought our experience, our discipline would overcome your material advantages. Perhaps it did sometimes, but not enough, never enough. These conversations, replicated across hundreds of interrogations, revealed a truth that would shape military doctrine for decades to come. The semi-automatic rifle wasn't just an incremental improvement, it was a fundamental shift in infantry combat. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, would later call the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. Coming from a man who had commanded millions of soldiers, who had coordinated the largest amphibious invasion in history, who had overseen the deployment of every weapon from fighter planes to atomic bombs, this was extraordinary praise. But Eisenhower had seen what the rifle meant to his soldiers, had read the after-action reports, had visited field hospitals where wounded men clutched their Garands like talismans. In the post-war years, as NATO formed and standardized equipment across member nations, the semi-automatic rifle became doctrine. The British, who had resisted the concept before the war, developed the FN-FAL. The Germans, rebuilding their military, adopted the G3. The Soviets, who had experimented with the SVT-40 but never fully committed, learned from the lesson and eventually fielded the SKS and AK-47. All of them owed a debt to John Garand's vision. But the human stories, the individual testimonies, those carried a weight that statistics never could. A sergeant from the 101st Airborne, writing home to his wife in 1944, penned these words: "The rifle they gave me, it never failed. Not once. Not in the drop into Normandy, when I landed in a ditch full of water. Not in the fighting through the hedgerows, when dirt and mud got into every crevice. Not in Bastogne, when it was so cold the skin would freeze to metal. It fired every time I pulled the trigger. I cleaned it when I could, oiled it when I had oil, and when I had neither, it still worked. I trust this rifle, like I trust you. It has saved my life more times than I can count." Another soldier, a corporal from the 1st Infantry Division, kept a journal. In it, he wrote about a firefight near Aachen. "We were pinned down by machine gun fire. Couldn't move, couldn't retreat, but we could shoot, and we did. All of us pouring fire at that gun position until it went quiet. My Garand got so hot I could barely hold it, but it never jammed, never hesitated. When it was over, when we could finally move forward, I found that machine gun. 3 Germans dead around it. I don't know which one of us got them, maybe all of us. But I know this, without these rifles we would have been the ones dead." These weren't tales of glory. They were testimonies of survival, of trust placed in a machine, and that trust rewarded. The M1 Garand didn't just fire bullets. It fired belief. Belief that reliability could win wars, that democracy could outproduce tyranny, that an immigrant's invention, mass-produced by a mobilized nation, could change the course of human history. German engineers, in the quiet years after defeat, admitted what their armies had learned in blood. "We underestimated the Americans, not their courage, we never doubted that, but their ability to turn industry into victory. That we did not foresee." The sound faded slowly. The echoes of 8 million rounds fired of clips ejecting with that distinctive ping of bolts, cycling in frozen forests and sun-scorched deserts. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, when the last shot was fired and the world began counting its dead, the M1 Garand remained. It would serve in Korea, where a new generation of soldiers would learn to trust its weight and rhythm. It would see jungles in Vietnam before finally being retired, replaced by lighter weapons, smaller calibers, new philosophies of warfare. But its legacy was more than military. The Garand represented something fundamental about the American century. It was the weapon of a citizen army carried by farmers and factory workers, by college students and coal miners. It was simple enough for a conscript to master in weeks, reliable enough to function in the hands of the terrified and inexperienced. It was the democratization of firepower made manifest. In the contrast between German precision and American production lay a broader truth: that progress is not always found in perfection, that the adequate when multiplied by millions outweighs the exceptional numbered in thousands. The rifle taught the world that wars are not won by engineers alone, but by nations willing to transform their entire society into an instrument of survival. Every woman on an assembly line, every train carrying crates to the coast, every ship braving U-boats to deliver weapons to the front, all of it connected by a thread of purpose. In every echo of that metallic ping was the sound of an age turning. From the old world of empires and aristocratic armies to the modern one of industrial democracies and citizen soldiers, the M1 Garand was the weapon that announced this transition. And the Germans listening in their foxholes and bunkers heard in that sound their own obsolescence. In the end, the M1 Garand was not feared for its power alone, but for what it represented. A weapon any man could use. A system any nation could mass produce. A philosophy that valued function over form, reliability over refinement. To the Germans, it was a mystery that revealed itself too late. To the Americans, it was a miracle born of necessity and vision. And in that miracle lay the secret of the 20th century. That progress is not born from perfection, but from persistence. That victory belongs not to those who build the best weapon, but to those who build enough good ones. John Garand's rifle changed not only the battlefield, but the rhythm of history itself. It proved that an immigrant's dream realized in the workshops of democracy could echo across continents and decades. War changes men, but invention changes the world. And this invention, this simple arrangement of steel and spring, changed both forever.